And we're live. Hi,
Hello.
everyone. Thank you very much for joining us to another episode of the Curious Leaders Path. Today, we're going to talk about breaking old patterns, and I'm very excited. I'm very excited for this conversation. Today, with me, as always, I've got Joanne Stone and Kat Von Madel, and let's, you know what? Let's put our names back on,
Oh,
and
nice.
let's jump right in and talk about, well, what do we mean when we talk about old patterns? What do we mean when we talk about patterns that don't serve us anymore?
Of course, we all have them, right?
Uh-huh.
So I think when we first started talking about this, and should we discuss this, we started actually talking about it more in terms of corporate and social patterns.
Hmm.
Patterns in society that happen over and over again, and that we say we want to break, but we don't. Corporate culture where we want it to change, but it never changes. And then what we were talking about is ultimately all of those patterns are human made, which means
Hmm.
they basically start with individuals, they start with us. And it's not that any one person is responsible for any patterns. It's really that the mindsets that we come with, and I define mindsets as beliefs, identities, and competencies,
Mm.
what we're able to do,
Hmm.
right? How we show up will influence those cultures, those patterns, those, how we operate. And if we don't have the competencies to deal with our fears that arise from those patterns, either from changing them or perpetuating them or whatever our relationship is, if we don't have the competency to do that and the competencies to work with other people to do that, and thirdly, the competencies to actually change the patterns, which is usually technical skills among other things,
Yeah,
then we'll never change them. So
right.
these patterns are really, how do we show up with our beliefs, our identities, our mindsets? And how do we influence what happens around us? And the more power we have, obviously, the more, and it's formal power as well as informal power. The
Yeah,
more power we have, the more strongly those patterns, we're going to be influencing them.
Well,
that's
and I think
interesting.
the other thing that I feel I keep going to origin stories, right, of any of these
Yeah.
things, but they are there to serve, right? They're there to kind of
Mm-hmm.
help us with reducing the amount of energy our brains are going to consume or our systems consume. So we develop these patterns so it's easier. It's easier energy. It's easier for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think these patterns culturally have been around. Like we get patterns handed down from parents to
Mm-hmm.
children. Even our cultures will hand it around, right? So, and I don't want to sit there and say they're bad either. They can be good, or they can be either way. I think it's just the impact that they actually make. But um, I do think that they're there to serve a good reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and I know for me, recognizing that there's these patterns, and also what I find patterns under patterns.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so
Oh
it's
my.
like, oh my
It's too
gosh, what's
meta.
that
It's too
pattern?
meta.
Yeah, I know it's very meta. It's like hold-ons, right? Yeah, it's like it's a huge kind of boom, boom, boom. Like we keep on getting patterns, but I guess there's this, what is a pattern like in terms of we're defining it, but do we have an example? Like, what's a pattern
Well,
for you? Yeah.
that's a really interesting one, because patterns are are
What's
are
that?
so patterns are very, like, they're cultural and they're personal, aren't they? um, and there's bunches of things that we do, that we've done in the past, that haven't served us, or that won't serve us in the future. Like, and it could be something that I think, or something that I believe, and maybe this is a good example, or a good opportunity for us to think of, a personal example, just so that we can understand. So, how personal and how intimate these things could be.
Yeah.
Let me just jump in
Yeah.
really quick. Patterns can be everything from how we relate to our partners, our friends, our bosses, our coworkers. It's anything. And just to sort of emphasize the definition of a pattern, it's all, and this is sort of what you were saying, Joanne, is it's anything where we perpetuate a behavior, often without analyzing it. So when we
Mm,
first create it, often there is some analysis, but then eventually it becomes a habit. And it can become a broken or a stuck pattern when it no longer serves its purpose, but we haven't analyzed it and we don't even necessarily know how to analyze it.
mm. We've always done
Yeah.
it this way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you sense it, you know it. Like it's like for me, I remember the one pattern I found out when I was being coached like about 5 years ago was the drama queen pattern, right? And how dramatic I was, right? And so everything was just always blown out of proportion or whatever the case may be. And we called her the drama queen. And it was like as soon as like seeing that pattern and hearing that pattern and going, oh, that's a really interesting pattern, but it would often come up in so many different ways, right? Different shapes. But it was really a great relief when I found it, because all of a sudden it's like, oh, and then I realized it was just there for a certain reason, and it was okay, right? And then it's just released from me, and I go, okay, that's gone. It's not that, it's always there in my mind, but it's not. It doesn't take over without me recognizing. Now I recognize it now, so it doesn't have a control of me. I have control of it, right? So which is really cool.
I'm curious if you would be interested in discussing that for the sake of our discussion here today.
Yeah, sure.
Would you be willing to do that? And I would ask you questions.
Yeah. I love it. Oh, okay. I'm like, yeah, gosh, you hear me.
Live public coaching.
All right.
No embarrassment there. You get to see a full Joanne. This is just awesome.
Yeah, and make sure you I think there's two things to say. Is number one, make sure that you're protecting yourself, right? Like don't.
Yeah.
The purpose of our conversation is for all of us to learn, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And at the same time, make it, anonymize things, make it abstract. Don't feel like it needs to be too personal, because I think it's really more about exploring the pattern rather than, I'll ask you personal questions for sure. But just, I don't think you necessarily have to answer any deep, dark secrets or anything. I don't think that really serves well, unless you want to. It could be really fun too.
That's okay.
We are recording.
Oh my gosh. It's viral now.
Now I need a mask or something.
Yeah. Okay, so do you want me to give you a little bit of context with the current situation and the drama that's coming up from that, or how would you like me to start?
Let's start with where did you notice it? And Todd, I wonder, sorry, Joanne, let me interrupt for a second while you just think about that. Todd, I wonder if what you can do is sort of abstract the things that we're talking about, because what's really important, I think, is that this isn't sort of a live coaching session only, but rather something where we can figure out how do we pull this into our work situation, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's by talking about something that's not necessarily work. Well, this is actually work related, but not too work related. I'm hoping that people don't feel too defensive. There's a bit of entertainment value in this. But then maybe what you can do is say, how do we actually apply this in a work setting? How do we apply this when our defenses are actually higher and that type of stuff?
I think I'd be happy to do that. And I would invite our audience to participate that way in the chat as well. I see that we've got Troy and Rashida already here with us. And if there's hi Troy, hi Rashida, and if there's anyone else who would like to chime in as we go through this, of course, we welcome that, and we'll see what comes up. But let's go for it. Let's go for some live coaching.
Excellent. So where have you noticed the patterns? And because you've already done a lot of work on this and you've already identified it, I think rather than going into the real discovery process, if you can just sort of encapsulate, where did you see that you did this?
So when you say where, because I'm also a very coached person, right? So I keep thinking, is that in the body or is it in a situation? Or when you say where
let's start in situations.
Okay, thank you. Okay, yeah, because I can go deep. It's in my big toe. In the situations, which I find is actually because I was flipping through my whole kind of Rolodex of that one. I find it when I can't control a situation. That's when it seems to kind of show up. So, when I am like. I used to remember doing these big, huge $50 million initiatives at TELUS, right? As a program manager, 200 or so people, like huge initiatives. And then I would get like, the things would get out of hand. And then I'd be just like, oh my gosh, gosh, and it's just like in my head, it was like, I wouldn't be doing it in front of all the people, but definitely in here, right? It's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to do that. Oh my gosh, I can't do that. Oh my gosh, it's just like, and it would just get so like, it would be a storm of drama that would kind of like,
panic? Was it panic drama or anger drama, or what sort of categories of emotion?
Well, that's very interesting. I think it's more of a panic, because when I think of, because the situation is now with my dog as well, right? With Link, he's been diagnosed with a hyperthyroid. So and so that my first thoughts are towards it could be cancer, right? Mm-hmm. So and so I get really scared, right, and upset about it. So I think it's more on the panic side, like because it's like it feels like I'm grasping. I don't want this to happen. I don't want this to happen, right? And so it's just like, yeah. So that's what it feels like. Yeah.
If it's panic, and this is the type of thing that if we really were doing a coaching session, we would have a much longer discussion around this. But when you think about it as panic, is it that you don't want to drop the ball? Is it that you don't want to be found out as a fraud? Is it that you think it's your job to save the world? And I'm asking you these questions, which actually require a lot of discovery. But since I know that you've done a lot of this work, I'm curious if you can interpret and skip the discovery stage.
My head's like going, woohoo! So I think what's coming up for me is, it's funny when you say discovered, that you kind of discovered as a fake, or discovered, it's like there's a lot of responsibility that comes up for me, right? Like I have this sense of responsibility for, these big, huge initiatives, or a sense of responsibility for my dog. I feel very responsible for a situation, right? And it's very upsetting. So I think it may stem from like being at fault, right? Like it's like, and I don't know where that was with the categories that you had, but I feel that, it's, being at fault, being the ones that's blamed for it. The dog, if he actually has this, I'll feel awful. I feel like, what did I do? I did something wrong. Was it just, there's so many things that have been happening to him, right? Yeah. That I'm taking it on myself as the responsibility, right? Or like I take the whole situation on as my responsibility, right? Yeah. Where it's totally unfair. Like it could be that dog food place that I bought it from, right?
Could be other toxins in the environment. Could be.
It could be a huge amount of different things, right? Yeah. It may have nothing to do with what I did or didn't do, but or maybe I did, but you know what? I learned, right? So what do you do with it versus getting all panicked and worried about it, right? But that's sort of what's. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you think about, so here we're going to go into a little bit more personal stuff. When were the first times that you noticed? Like if you think back to young adulthood, childhood, early profession, how far back can you remember you having these types of responses?
Well, there's a couple of different situations. So one is definitely on the soccer field. When I was a kid in school, where I had the ball. I was the only one who had the ball. The situation is I had control of the ball, and then I hit it into my own net.
Oh, and professionals have done that too, just for the record.
I know, but that poor child was devastated. She was just like, was only trying to do the best for everybody, thought it would be a great thing to do, but then got defeated like by the, like, it was a public school thing. Yeah. I can remember that, right? As that feeling. I'm just trying to like get into back to my current feeling of not I don't know if I felt sort of like this panic of, I did feel panic in the session in the second that I got the ball, right? I got to do this thing. I got to do it right. Because otherwise, everyone's looking at me. It's like all of a sudden there's attention on me, right? And it's like, I got to do something. It's got to be the right thing that I do, right? So yeah, I think that's the earliest time I can remember. I'm sure there's others, but
Yeah.
Well,
it'll take me a while to kind of find those.
Yeah. Again, if we were in a coaching session, we would get a lot more personal. We would get a lot deeper.
Of course.
My speculation, based on the research that I've done on how people's mindsets develop, where they develop from, how we reinforce them, it's almost always from childhood. Yeah. And it's usually not just one situation. It's usually more than one situation, unless it's a really extreme situation. And so without sort of planting seeds or making any suggestions or accusations or anything, a lot of times it comes from experiences we had in the home with people that were supposed to love us and protect us. And it's not necessarily that we were surrounded by bad people. It's just that everybody's got limitations, right? So chances are the pattern that you've got is that you needed to defend yourself, right? If you think about our nervous system, when we recognize some sort of a threat or when we sense some sort of a threat, we either go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fawn is sort of the fourth, it's a new addition to defining what our responses are. So if you think about the drama queen and the way that you described it, which is really sort of trying to push away the responsibility of what happened, that's a very defensive, that's sort of almost a fight response.
Right.
And as a woman, there's probably some gender stuff in there in terms of, you're not actually allowed, what men are more socialized to do. And I'm not saying every man is like this, and I'm definitely not saying every woman is like this as well. But generally, men tend to be more aggressive and they blame other people outright. And you see that in the business world a lot, especially when the stakes are high. As women, we can't do that. So we have to find sort of an indirect way. And again, this is stereotypically, and every culture will be different. Every family will be different. But we can't blame other people, but we have to find a way to deflect. That's sort of a fight response, right?
Yeah.
So what I just did with you is got you to think about the characteristics. And it's not really trying to analyze the actual situations where you did it, because the situations are just situations.
Right.
What you want to do is analyze sort of what are the characteristics of the pattern.
Yeah.
Then try and get to what's the history of it? Where did it come from?
Yeah.
And then once you've identified where it came from, and it's not so important to know specifically, this happened, then this happened, this person did it to me, that person did it to me, or reinforced it or whatever. It's more that you get in touch with the emotion of what that root feeling is. Yeah. And I would suggest for a lot of people, there's an element of abandonment in almost everything that we do. Yeah.
I was totally abandoned as a child. So
Yeah.
there were 6 of us. Okay. I was left at home behind a curtain while my mother counted all the kids in the car a half an hour later to know that one kid was gone.
Oh my goodness.
It was me.
Oh my goodness.
I fell asleep.
And there's some themes emerging in what's happening here as well. And I think that's the thing that's interesting, because the very personal experience, Joanne, that you have, I think can extrapolate, and we can probably see some opportunities to look at that. Like, when I think of what you're talking about, the themes that are emerging are things like, taking it very personally and feeling blame, feeling fault, feeling some insecurity, some concept of unfairness. And the other theme that emerged was really a merging of that which we can control and that which we can't control. And right, so when we think of that more broadly within the context of work and within the context of our office situations, it can be really, really troubling if all of that stuff gets in the way. And I bet that it wouldn't be hard for us to come up with patterns, particularly leadership patterns, that exercise some of these same things, right? And I think that we've all been in situations where we see a leader who showed up and is reacting from a place of fear, or is reacting from a place of insecurity, or is reacting from a place of uncontrol, feeling out of control, right? Which is a really scary place for a leader to be.
And if
And
you
we've
think
talked in
about
the
that if you think about that out of control, sorry to interrupt you, Todd.
No, go
If you
ahead.
think about that out of control or the fear, anger, almost all of that comes from I'm not enough. I'm
Yes.
unlovable. I'm going to be abandoned by the tribe and left to fester and rot.
Right.
Like it's pretty horrid. And none of this is conscious for us. This is all in our nervous system. And people will say it's in the limbic system, blah, blah, blah. I believe it's in the nervous system, not so much in the brain. It doesn't matter where it is. The point is we are pack animals. If we have any fear of being abandoned by our pack,
Yep.
we basically believe we're going to die, right? And all of those fears of the leader that those leaders have, and I've seen it, all of those fears that they've got is really fear of abandonment, fear of not enoughness.
Okay, so here's my question. I'm a leader. I want to apply my curiosity, my natural, honest, transparent curiosity to situations where I feel this stuff. How can I tell? How can I
And
tell?
how can you tell where it comes from, or how can you tell?
How can I tell where that's what the motivation is in the actions, in me following a pattern that I'm just used to? How can I tell?
So I'll just go through what I've been doing for the last, as soon
Yeah.
as I got into coaching. It's usually I it's not the first place I go, right? There's a story that's in there, and it's like there's levels, like I think I was talking earlier. It's like the hold-ons, right? So where I see my patterns typically show up because I'm trying to do a thing, right? I'm trying to do that. I'll call it, I have that one big thing I want to do, or that thing that's really important to me, but I can't seem to get to that thing. So if that thing is, I want to establish like a healthy, I want to feel good, right? A healthy body, right? And it's just like, damn it, all I need to do is just, do that, exercise that thing or whatever. But there's a pattern that's within me that just doesn't want to do a regular routine. It doesn't want to do a regular. So it's like, this is really weird, right? So I've been trying to work on that pattern for a super long time with like very little success, right? So I've had to kind of like, okay, well, like if I can't get into a routine, what are the other ways that I can kind of get into it? But like for me, I think when leaders or the team or anyone's stuck, usually it's about finding what is that maybe surface pattern first, right? Like there seems to be a pattern here. What are we seeing it's causing us to not move forward? Oh, it's this. Okay, great. So now what we're trying to do now is trying to do a shift in the system, right? To shift it to something else. So you can dive into that particular pattern itself to kind of like figure out the root cause and the whys and the 5 whys or whatever the case may be in a system. Or you can go deeply into your own and journal it. Like I went through pages and pages of journaling as to, well, where did that come from? Like, and so how did that show up? And then where did that come from? And then I kept on going and doing all the whys on myself. And it finally ended up into this particular space. But I think that like for the ability for most people, they may not have the ability to have a coach or I would always suggest getting coaches for everybody, but they may not have access to a specific coach. So for me, I think it's like, if we figure out there's a pattern that's in the way of doing a certain thing, that's the first thing to identify that particular pattern. And then to be able to recognize how it shows, if it's me and my personal pattern. So my personal pattern of being drama queen, for example, I know that pattern was there to keep me safe. It was there to keep me safe. It loves me and it shows up and it's just like, I can see the girl. She comes up over here. So, but it's helped me, and it's also been not so great for me. So it's just like, okay, I see you. Thank you very much for showing up. I really appreciate you, but I've got the situation. Right. And I'm okay. I'm a grown up. I've got it. I can go ahead and do it. So for me, it's always about seeing that pattern, recognizing it's there, naming it, right? And just
naming it.
That's
exciting. Naming it. Right? Who are you? Who are you? Why are you here? What are you called? What's your narrative? What's your story?
And naming
And
it
it's
with
really
love.
looking at it from all different angles to see what's going on, rather than just accepting that it's
Yeah.
there. And I think that's what I'm hearing you talk about, Joanne.
Yeah. And not pushing
And it
it
has to
down.
be done with love. It has to be done with love, right?
Yes,
It's not
it
that
has to be
damn
done.
pattern.
Yes.
It's that
Yeah.
it's that amazing pattern that, again, what Joanne said, that saved me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because what saves us, and this is the other thing that's true too, because from a leadership perspective, what keeps us safe can create the opposite of safety for the people around us sometimes.
Mhm.
And I think an awareness of that is important too. And certainly I've exhibited patterns like that too. In my earlier career, I've been very fight prone, rather than flight or fawn or freeze. And I know that there's teams that I've worked with, possibly some teams that I've worked with who are with us on this call today, who can probably attest to some of those behaviors from the past.
Yeah. I love
So-
Izzy's comment of with gratitude as well, like real gratitude. There's,
Yes.
one of my lifelong patterns was the warrior. That's how I survived. I had a pretty rough
Yeah.
childhood, is a nice, polite way of saying it.
Mhm.
And I survived it just by being super, super aggressive, which is why I did sports so aggressively and, went into the financial industry and everything else.
Mhm.
And finally, when I realized it wasn't serving me anymore, I basically named my warrior princess and asked her to retrain. And every time my anger would come up, I would have a little conversation with my lovely warrior princess and basically say, okay, is this really the right, of course I had to manage my emotions.
Mhm.
And then
Yeah.
when I was a little bit more rational, to actually have a conversation and say, I wonder if that was really the best way to respond, and really try and have like an adult conversation with, this scared, basically this terrified little girl inside, right?
Wow.
And I can tell you many stories about how profoundly that shifted. It took me a few years to do it
Yeah.
very successfully, but I can tell you some pretty amazing stories, like really profound stories where, somebody was actually threatening me quite severely when I lived in China. And my response was literally with no anger. And I realized that my anger theoretically was actually sitting beside me, and I was conversing with my anger. And not only did I win the battle, I also got a raise after that. And the guy was not just threatening my job, he was threatening my survival too. Actually,
Wow.
it was a very serious situation.
Wow.
It was my boss basically, and he was threatening my life. And I'm not saying that as a joke. So not only did I win the battle, I also got a raise and a whole bunch of other things. And that was completely
Yeah.
because I sort of had made friends with this warrior princess.
Yeah. And you gave her a different job description. She became an advisor rather than someone
Yeah.
in control,
Yeah.
right? And Rashida observed here that unlearning old habits is
Yeah.
one of the most difficult things in dealing with acquiring new patterns and new traits. And I
Right.
agree. Listen, I hate to be the one to do this, but
Oh,
we're
man.
almost.
We're there.
I know, right? Like it's 30 minutes and it's gone past like in a heartbeat. So, how do we want to wrap this one up? Any last words?
Yeah, you know what? The one thing I would sit there and say that to break some of these habits, it takes grit.
Grit.
Courage.
Yeah. And because I think this isn't something it's like fighting over willpower, right? Like it's just having
Yeah.
enough willpower to break some of these patterns. It's like I don't think it comes naturally. It actually, you have to be very purposeful
Yes.
in doing it, right? So either you journal or you, like my newest one is just saying no today. No, you're not going to do that. I'm sorry. This is a no. And I'm responding really well to it too. And I'm going, this is so cool. But it's like, it's setting up, it's having grit, like whatever that is that will help you with the pattern change. Like if you figured that out, it's like journaling or whatever, but grit is going to be on your side. So
Yeah.
that's what comes up.
And I would say, I would add to that courage and love. Because it really is a matter of so we use the term breaking the habit, but it's actually not breaking it. I come from ranching. I've spent a lot of time on ranches, and when you actually want to break a horse, you don't actually want to break it. That's the old
Right.
school where you overpower it, right? And it really is about how can you get the horse to want to serve you in the way that you need it to for the sake of the ranch work, right? And I think we need to treat our habits, our patterns, our personas all the same way, with a lot of love, a lot of courage, a lot of analysis, and reflection, which is, Joanne, sort of what you're talking about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Love that
Yeah.
metaphor of a wild horse. That's
I do
awesome.
too. And as a former equestrian, I particularly appreciate that.
I didn't know that.
It's a lot of fun. Listen, I can't add anything to courage, love, and grit. I think that those are really the things. And all I'll say is, like, and approach it as fearlessly as we possibly can. And that's where curiosity comes in, because
Yeah.
I've said this to you guys before. I think I've said it on this broadcast before. I think that curiosity is the antidote to fear. When we can
Yeah.
be genuinely curious, then we don't need to be afraid. We can be full of wonder and awe. And if we don't understand it, that's okay, because looking at it from a bunch of different angles is going to help us understand it. And I think that's our time. I love talking to you two. I love talking to you two. And I love all of the people who joined us too today.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
being here.
Yeah.
Really appreciate this. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your evening if you're joining us from the Eastern Time Zone, or rest of your day if you're joining us from somewhere else, or rest of your late evening if you're joining us from somewhere very far away. But thank you so much. And thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Kat, as always. This has been such a pleasure.
All
Thank
right.
you. Thanks to everybody else too.
For sure.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.